Good morning, everyone. Today we will continue in the series of lecture Learning for Commons with the honorable presence of the Professor Tom Vermaat. This series of lectures is part of the research activities of the thematic project Architecture and Urbanism Address the Social Space in the 21st Century, founded by FAPESP and developed in partnership with the universities ETH Zurich, Harvard, TU Delft, KTH, and UPN. The intention of this series of lectures is broaden our understanding of the spatial and urban consequence of the concept of the urban commons or commons in general. It's a concept that has become fundamental for understanding of contemporary urban process and the role of architecture in this context, made in light of the current crisis of the economic and political models. I must emphasize that your guest today, Professor Vermaat, has been an effective and fundamental partner in your audacious project that intends to understand the place of the architecture and the urbanism in this complicated beginning of the century. His approach to the concept of the common goods in architecture have awakened new and exciting possibilities for architectural criticism. Through then, we have managed to establish a fruitful dialogue between the spatial process that occur in the global north and south, something very important nowadays. I would even say that it's mandatory to understand the space in the century. With Tom, we had the pleasure to edit and organize the book, The New Urban Condition, Criticism and Theory from Architecture and Urbanism, published by Routledge this year. Well, I pass the screen to Professor Ana Cavalcante, who will be the moderator today, and thank you again, Tom, for being with us.
Thank you, Professor Leandro, as always, for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you were watching us. Special greeting to our students who are watching us today. We have organized this series of lectures to discuss the commons from different perspectives, and we've invited specialized researchers who are dealing with the topic of the commons from different disciplines, ranging from urban theory, urban design, and urban governance. We are very pleased and honored to receive today Professor Tom Vermaat from ETH Zurich, who is a pioneer in addressing the topic of the commons in the disciplines of architecture and urbanism. Professor Tom Vermaat is the head of the Chair of History and Theory of Urban Design at ETH Zurich, and in his writings, Professor Tom Vermaat addresses the commons into three perspectives that he elaborated. The first is the res communis, the common resources of the cities. The second is the lex communis, or the ways we can arrange to protect the commons in the city. And the third are the praxis communities, that are the ways that we can build the cities collaboratively. Today, Professor Tom will present the lecture titled The City as Commons, Three Perspectives for an Alternative Urban Designer. And before giving the floor or the screen to Professor Tom Vermaat, I'll make some quick remarks. Professor Tom Vermaat will talk for about 30 minutes, and his lecture will be followed by a Q&A session. So please feel free to already formulate your questions and post them on the YouTube chat. Your questions can be framed both in Portuguese and in English. Your Portuguese questions will be translated to English. So please, Professor Tom Vermaat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, to Professor Leandro Medrano and Dr. Ana Rosa Chavas Cavalcanti for the very, very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to discuss this topic with you, a topic that of which has been said. It's a topic that interests me for a long time, and now you should be able to see my main screen. Is that so? I hope so. Okay, the city as commons, three perspectives for an alternative future or for an alternative urban design and urban designer. That is the title of my lecture today. And the reason that I'm, let's say, insisting upon this topic of the commons is because, of course, the topic of the commons is not something that exists only in the field of architecture, urbanism, and urban design. But over the past few years, panoply, I would say, of innovative thinking, scholarship, and projects that focus on the commons have gained momentum. Inspired by the seminal publication, Governing the Commons, which you see to the left-hand side, a book of 1990 by Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, many fields of thinking and practice have been reflecting upon the commons, thinking differently about geography, ecology and economy, as some of the books on the screen are.
Excuse me, Professor Tom. Excuse me, Professor Tom Avermaet. We can't see your screen, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Please,
I'll try again.
no, never mind. We take your time.
Yeah, we are going to try again then. Okay, I'm very sorry for that. So do you see my screen right now?
No, right now it's opening. Thank you. I will confirm to you now. Right now we can see your screen. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I was speaking about these three books as indeed three books representing, let's say, the current interest in the commons in a variety of fields. But what let's say interests me, of course, in this lecture is what this concept of the commons can mean for the realms of architecture and for the realm of urban design. Some of you might say, well, this seems to be a rather obvious question, let's say, but I would like to argue here that the question is maybe not as obvious as we think about it, because when I'm looking to the way that the commons has been introduced in the theories and the practice of urban design and of architecture, I think that there are two important issues that are at stake. The first issue is that the commons is almost always equaled with social processes. So when theoreticians in the field of architecture or in the field of urban design, they speak about the commons, they very often equalize the notion of the commons with processes of managing, of steering, of gathering, let's say as well. And what I would like to propose to you today is a reading that goes beyond these social processes. And a second issue that in my opinion is at stake is that the commons are often considered as antithetical or opposite to the state and the market. And I think that this is also a bit of a misconception of the commons, because I think that the commons is, as Elinor Ostrom is writing that so adequately in her book, it's beyond the state and the market, meaning that some of the aspects of the commons, for instance, the collective care, which is normally assigned to the state, or the private profit, which is normally assigned to the market, are in some kind of way living on, further considered within our conceptualizations of the commons. It is, of course, very true that in the field of architecture and urban design, we have been conditioned, I would say, to think about the production of the architecture of the city in a twofold perspective. Or, and that's what the book to the left-hand side is representing, we understand the production of the architecture of the city as the outcome of a powerful state apparatus, of a state commissioning big projects, as I've been doing myself in the book that you see to the left-hand side. Or we understand the production of the architecture of the city as a matter of the market, as for instance is represented in this book of Jason Hackworth, who's speaking about a neoliberal city. These perspectives of understanding the architecture of the city as all related to the state or all related to the market are part of our contemporary thinking, but are also part of our historiographies. When we look at our historiographies, we've been time and time again assigning the agency of the production of the architecture of the city or to the state or to the market. What I would like to propose to you today is indeed an alternative understanding of the role of the commons in the fields of architecture and urban design. maybe also speaking about a different agency. So not only the agency of the market, neither the agency of the state, but the agency of what I call the commons. And at the end of my lecture, I will try to suggest to you, and that's maybe a nice opening for our discussion, that this can also lead to a different definition of what a design project is and what the role of the designer is. So another perspective, the perspective of the commons, which is another agency and which can make us understand in a different way how we conceive of a design project and how we conceive of the designer. So let's start with understanding what these commons can mean for the field of architecture and for the field of urban design. And as was already said in the very kind introduction, I'm trying to understand this role of the commons in the field of architecture and in the field of urban design by looking at three particular aspects of the commons. Aspects that are interrelated, that's why I represent them in the form of a triangle here, and aspects that I'm calling res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis, three Latin terms which refer to, as you can see, to common resources, common codes, and common practices. My exploration of the commons starts by necessity with what I would say its most basic definition, the idea of common resources or common pool resources. So in this section, I want to explore with you for a moment the idea of common resources, and particularly the common resources that we can find in relation to the architecture of the city. Political theorist Michel Bouwens is, I think, very helpful to help us think about what these common resources in relation to the architecture of the city could be. Bouwens is differentiating, as you can see on the screen, between what he's calling inherited commons, which he relates to earth, water, forests, also things that we find in and around our cities. He's speaking about immaterial commons, speaking about knowledge, arts, crafts, also very often part of our cities. And then the third element that he's speaking about is material commons. And he's speaking about man-made and man-handled materials. And of course, also our cities can be looked upon from this particular perspective. For me, it is interesting, as somebody who's a professor for the history and theory of urban design, it is interesting to understand that within our long history of the architecture of the city, taking care of common resources has always been an important assignment for architects and for urban designers. One of the best examples that I can give to you is this example of the so-called Boston Common. Still existing until today, the common in the city of Boston was a green and open space on which individual and collective interests were mediated. And you see that common, if you look at the map to the right-hand side, this is a map from the 18th century. To the left-hand side, you see a map of the 19th century, or a representation, of the 19th century, where I think you see very, very clearly how different practices were taking place on that commons. It was it's a space where individual and collective interests were negotiated, not by the state, nor by the market, but by local processes, local collective processes of negotiation. What is very important to me is that architecture played a very important role in governing, unlocking and maintaining the common pool resource. And this is, of course, one of these inherited common pool resources in the terms of Michel Bouwens. It's about greens, it's about trees and green fields in the city center. What I would like to suggest to you is that if we look at representations as the one that we have on the screen, that the common in the urban landscape was maintained by the buildings along its perimeters, combined with a system of paths and fences, as you can see. The very interrelation between the open space of the commons and the monumental fronts of the public buildings along it acted as a sort of protecting belt for this intra-urban common pool resource of the commons. At the same time, we could say, of course, that the programmatic variety of the buildings around these commons also made sure that this common pool resource would be used by a variety of groups. And that's what we see when we look at the commons, at the Boston Commons through time. We see that it was a place for activities of various groups of citizens that could coexist in this particular place of the commons, from more private purposes such as farming and military training, as you see here, to more public purposes, as we see on the screen here. Public purposes as gathering, holding festivals. At some points there were even manifestations and executions on the Boston Commons as well. So the Boston Commons is in some kind of way a commons that represents this idea of a productive resource in the middle of the city of Boston. A productive resource that is used for grazing, for other more productive activities, but is at the same time also a leisurely resource, a resource on which pop concerts and so on could be organized. The Boston Commons is a very old commons, let's say, an old commons where a spatial resource, an inherited green resource were shared amongst various groups of citizens, but there are also other examples of that. Here I'm having on the screen an example from the Fiemme Valley community in the Trentino Alto Adige region, which is at the border of Switzerland and Italy, where indeed, and here you see that region. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look upon in the light green outline on the map, you see this Val di Fiemme. So that's where we are. This is Italy, and the top is Switzerland. And in this valley, there are many smaller towns which also have pooled natural inherited resources. And how did this look? It looked in this way. As you can see, these were towns in mountainous regions where small kitchen gardens, as we can see here on the screen, but also small open spaces were pooled amongst various households. Here we see how this pooling is taking place with stairs leading you up to the various houses, and how indeed the results are very, very intricate places with many entrances as well. A spatial resource, an inherited resource that indeed becomes part of a bigger pooled resource and gets an architectural shape. Here you see again one of these shared open spaces in these towns, and you see the multiplicity of entrances to this shared open space. For me, this shared open space, it's not a fully collective space. It's a space that belongs to these families living around this space. And in that sense, in my mind, it's an example of how the architecture of the city is unlocking this space as a common pool resource. So here we see how architecture time and time again takes a certain kind of attitude as unlocking and at the same time also maintaining a common resource, in this case, the common resource of an inherited common resource. So that's what I mean with this res communis. The second term that I would like to introduce to you is my term of praxis communis. Praxis communis is said very, very strongly related to res communis as well, but nevertheless showing us a different sort of aspect of what the commons are and what they can mean for the architecture of the city. Praxis communis is, I think, quite well described by the Austrian-Hungarian philosopher Ivan Illich, who writes in his book Tools for Conviviality that there are always convivial processes involved in the commons between people and their environment. in some kind of way suggesting us that the commons is also always about a relation between people and their environment, not a distance, not a relation of keeping distance, but a relation of engagement. You can read together with me the second part of Illich's, the citation of Illich's tools for conviviality, in which he's saying that they enhance the contribution of autonomous individuals and primary groups to the total effectiveness of a new system of production. So what Illich is telling to us is that there is a relation of engagement which is contributing to the production of the city. We have also people like David Bollier, another great thinker of the commons, who is saying that in a commons there is always not only this relation of engagement, but what David Bollier is calling care work, caring for this resource, caring for the environment that you are part of. And David Bollier, as you can see in the first citation, is contrasting that very, very strongly to capitalist markets, in which indeed the relation is not one of care, but is one of commodities, let's say, of gain. So this idea of a care economy that is always important in these practices of commoning. Bollier is also saying that the people who are engaging in these practices of commoning, that they take pride and pleasure, as you can see on the screen, in becoming what he calls stewards of resources. By stewards, he means that they really are caretakers of these resources. It's interesting to understand that you can live in a city in a very anonymous way, in a very detached way, let's say, but there is also another suggestion here, namely the suggestion that you can keep a relation of engagement to the city in which you're living, and that you can develop practices of care and become a sort of steward of that environment. A good way of illustrating what these praxis communis can mean for the built environment is the example of Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes was a biologist, but also an urban planner living in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in the British city of Edinburgh, a city which was at the time a very industrial city. You see a representation of that city to the right-hand side. And what normally the city administration of Edinburgh wanted to change the city, and the normal thing the normal path to follow, would have been to commission an architect or an urban designer to make a new plan for the city, as we are still doing right now. And there is a problem with the neighborhood of the city, and somebody, a so-called expert, is commissioned to make a new big plan. But Patrick Geddes, being a biologist and an urban planner, he suggested another sort of approach. He suggested an approach in which the praxis communis, so the practices of many people, namely the people who were living in the city of Edinburgh, would now generate the knowledge to change the city. And he introduced something which he called the Civic Survey. You see this, the frontispiece of the Civic Survey to the right-hand side. And in this Civic Survey, the idea was that those people who are practicing the city, who are caring about that city, that they have a lot of knowledge. And that knowledge should be tapped into to think about the future of the city. So what Geddes did is that he selected a group of people, the so-called Civic Survey committee, which you see on the screen here right now, and asked them to activate their own knowledge and the knowledge of their fellow citizens in order to survey the city, in order to generate an idea about the city. And surprisingly, this pointed to a lot of forgotten spaces, these kind of spaces which you see on the screen right now. Sometimes these were back courtyards, back alleys, which were discovered and identified by the citizens of Edinburgh as valuable spaces, spaces where the kids could play, spaces where even small things could be grown. But very often, the difficulty with these spaces was that they were not accessible. So what Geddes was doing was activating these praxis communis, these collective practices. People were passing by there, the kids were already playing there, and tapping into that knowledge. And the result was this, that the new map of Edinburgh was drawn. And this is the new map of Edinburgh. And when you look very carefully, you see that on this map, there's a whole set of green patches. And these green patches were in the very, very city center of Edinburgh, newly discovered spaces. And what Geddes did then, using the collective practices, is that they built small urban elements like these stairs, which we see on the screen right now, which could unlock these spaces to the broader citizens of Edinburgh. So by making a little access point, and these access points were realized, as you can see here, suddenly these forgotten spaces in the city, these back courts, these back alleys, now became part of the city. Geddes not only tapped into the praxis communis to get more specific knowledge about these specific places, but also suggested to the people who were living in Edinburgh that they should care about these resources. And that's what he called civic action. He worked with the people in order to maintain these places, in order to cultivate these places, as you can see to the right-hand side, where some of these places, they became kitchen gardens for the citizens of Edinburgh, as you can see on these images as well. This idea of tapping into the praxis communis is not only something from the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, but is also important in the 21st century. Here I'm showing you an example of a symbol, the so-called folly for a flyover, in which indeed a symbol was also using the knowledge of citizens to identify very, very difficult places in the city as valuable places. And this is one of them, as you can see, located between two highways in Hackney. They identified a space that could be used for exhibitions and performances. And so what Assemble did this is in London, Hackney, London, to be very precise, in the UK. What Assemble did is that they constructed with the citizens a temporary pavilion that could be constructed temporarily and that also could be deconstructed. That was very important. But even more important is that this space, which was considered previously not so valuable, but through tapping into the praxis communis was identified as a valuable place, now could be used for several performances, as you see here, screenings of films, exhibitions, and so on. This project was indeed dismantled after a few months, but this identification of this place as a valuable place led the municipality of Hackney to install or to think about a new project, which was then afterwards realized at the same place. So this is this praxis communis, the idea of the agency of communing, the agency of citizens and professionals, and also a new sort of relation to common resources that emerges from these collective practices and the knowledge that is embedded in these collective practices. And then I come to my last term, and that's what I'm calling the lex communis. And the lex communis is really the idea that we need to understand that the architecture of the city is not always, let's say, taught anew. The idea is that within the city, there are certain common codes, certain common laws, let's say, that can be helpful to look at and that can be helpful to think about. And a beautiful example that I can give about the lex communis and how that can affect the city is the example of the so-called corps des ponts et chaussées. The corps des ponts et chaussées is bringing us to France, the France of the 18th century, as you can see on the screen. And in this France of the 18th century, there was a big administration that was responsible for building the new bridges and roads all through the French territory. And instead of making, and here you see the headquarters of that administration. But what was very interesting of this administration is that this administration was not making very specific plans for the territory, for the bridges and the roads in the territory. Rather, they were defining a set of principles. Principles, for instance, to change the city of Paris. Here you see one of these engineers of the Pont et Chaussée, Adolphe Alphand, who was going to change the roads in Paris. And for doing that, he was not making a very precise plan, but he was starting to suggest these kind of codes, I would say, these kind of elements that speak about vegetation in the city, elements that speak about the water in the city with these small fountains, elements that speak about the fountains of the city. So on the one hand, elements, and on the other hand, proposals of how these elements could be combined in, as you see, for instance, in the top images, in smaller roads. In the lower images, you see these bigger, typical French boulevards. So not designing a continuous project for a particular place, but thinking about elements and how to combine them. That's what I would call a lex communis, a common code for the city that could be implemented, that could be interpreted through time in order to make the various roads and bridges in the cities. And that's what led to these very well-known boulevards in cities like Paris, as we see on the screen here. The Pont et Chaussée was not only doing that for outdoor public spaces, but also for indoor public spaces. This is another example of Louis Bruyère, who was also working at this Pont et Chaussée, and who was designing the various indoor markets for cities like Paris, Lyon, and so on. And what he did is that he didn't design the specific outline of the building, but again, designed a set of elements and codes of how to combine these elements, resulting in indeed these various marchés, couverts as they are called, which we now can find throughout the French territory. The interesting thing is that these codes, they were also discussed in the journal of the Pont et Chaussée, the so-called Annales des Ponts et Chaussées, in which then different architects, local and Parisian, were discussing with one another about how these codes should evolve, should develop through time as well. A little example of indeed comparing bridges and trying to assess how well the codes worked for these different bridges. But codes were not only a prerequisite of the 19th or the 18th century with the Pont et Chaussée, but codes were also used in the 20th century. And I think a last and interesting example that I would like to show to you is the reconstruction of Agadir. Agadir is a city in Morocco that was destroyed in 1960 completely by an earthquake, as you can see on the images here. And there again, the urban planners of the city decided not to make a very precise urban plan, but a very open zoning, as you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, an open zoning, and combining that open zoning with a set of codes. And in Agadir, the codes were very much about the materiality of the city. Here you see a few lines of that codes of Agadir. Buildings need to have a simple structural form in plan and elevation. Masonry may be of burnt clay brick, concrete blocks, or of stone, unreinforced, but must be contained in panels supported around the perimeters by reinforced concrete work. Buildings should contribute to the public spaces of the city. These were, let's say, the codes, the lex communis, I would say, that the city planners of Agadir were setting into place. And within these codes, several architects, tens and tens of different architects started to work and started to rebuild this city. And here we have an aerial photograph where we see the initial parts of this new city. You see already quite a bit of buildings, all done by different architects, but within the same codes. And that's how these buildings look. You recognize the concrete, the very strong use of concrete and then infill. You also recognize that all of these buildings, they are contributing to the public space with galleries, with sort of covered spaces as well, with these big passages, all different architects, but working together within the same material codes, and as a result, forming a very, very consistent city. That's what I call lex communis, a matter of common codes and conventions that relate to materiality, to elements, to typologies, and to composition, but which are upheld by the different people producing the city, and in some kind of way create a collective idea. So this was my admittedly rather rapid introduction to what I'm calling res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis. Understanding the city as built up of common resources, understanding the city as built up of common practices, and understanding the city as built up of common codes. Designed common codes, but sometimes also undesigned common codes. I didn't show an example of that in my lecture of today. And now my question comes, if we look upon the city, of the architecture of the city, from this res communis, praxis communis, and lex communis, wouldn't that give us an opportunity to think anew about what an architectural or an urban project is about? Wouldn't we say then that indeed an architectural or an urban project is more about caring about common resources? So not making the grand gesture, but caring about the common resources that are already present in the city. Wouldn't we say that an architectural or urban project then is about activating common practices instead of looking upon them or trying to quantify them? Wouldn't we say that our role as architects and urban designers is about indeed, and our understanding of the architectural project is that that's more about re-articulating common codes or working within common codes than trying to think about the radically new? This is a question that I would like to discuss with you in our discussion, in our Q&A in a moment. So wouldn't we say that when we look upon the architecture of the city simultaneously as res communis, as praxis communis, and as lex communis, that changes our idea of what an architectural project is about or an urban project is about? And then my last question, wouldn't we also say that this idea of looking to the architecture of the city as commons also requires that we think our role of architects and of urban designers in a new way? Shouldn't we say that instead of an architect becoming indeed somebody that proposes avant-garde, radical new forms, that the architect becomes a caretaker of common resources, or that the architect becomes an activator of common practices, or the architect as a re-articulator of existing codes or a redefiner of existing codes? This is really the questions that I would like to pose to you. Doesn't indeed looking upon the architecture of the city as a commons require that we rethink what a design project is on the one hand, and on the other hand, what the role of the architect and the urban designer is? Moving away from this heroic idea of the architect and from a heroic idea of the architectural project, and moving into an idea where the project and the designer are much more a sort of reaction vis-à-vis this idea of the commons. Thank you. Now I need to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor Tom Avermaet, for this wonderful lecture and for making this clear contribution to the theory of the commons by elaborating some of the concepts and the rationale that is present in economic theory or in political theory into a language that is totally devoted to architecture and urbanism. I will open now our Q&A session. Please feel free to formulate your questions both in Portuguese and English. And while people are warming up, I would like to that you elaborate more on those three concepts of res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis in the way that these concepts intertwine and with respect to your theoretical background.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think thanks for your question, and as said, I mean, I'm also open to take whatever question for further clarification. To me, what was very important, and which I only could touch upon in the small lecture of today, is that indeed these notions of res communis, praxis communis, and lex communis, they are very much intertwined. And what do I mean by that? That of course, in some kind of way, in all case studies that I show to you, all of them are simultaneously present, let's say. So let's take the example of Patrick Geddes. I'm still very fascinated by that example of Patrick Geddes because I think it's almost a contemporary example, but only more than a century ago. I think what was so fantastic in the case of Patrick Geddes that he used the praxis communis, so the people going into the city, talking to their fellow citizens, in order to identify the common resources, let's say the res communis, we could say. And to me, the various stairs that they were designing, they belong to the lex communis, I would say. They are the elements that allow us to use that resource in a particular way, to get access to that resource in a particular way. So although, of course, I split them a bit because of the lecture today, you will see that in all of these examples that I've shown, that they are very much intertwined, as it were, these res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis. And sometimes there are even several levels, let's say. What I like a lot is that you see that sometimes one of these elements are taking, let's say, running forward as it were, are taking the lead, as it were. That's what I'm searching for, are taking the lead. So for instance, if you think about the example of Geddes, it is because people were already practicing these spaces, because kids were already living there, or somebody was already having a little bit of a sort of garden in some of these background spaces, that they could be recognized and that they could become recognized as a res communis, let's say. So sometimes the practice is rediscovering discovering the res communis, let's say, as one I've seen that a lot in my research, that though there is this triangle of res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis, that very often one of them is a bit predominant, let's say, and is taking the advantage. And I think for us as architects, it's so important that when we look at the architecture of the city, that we try to, in some kind of way, do that exercise. What do we see in terms of res communis? What do we see in terms of praxis communis? How can we relate to that praxis communis? How can that become part of our project and of our role as an architect as well? I think that is extremely important, I would say. I don't know if there are already any questions.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, I have a question too.
Yes.
Thank you again for your inspiring talking. But my questions relate to the issues of the common problems or the common use, in architecture. Your research sheds light to usual, as Anna said, the possibilities between architecture and the concept of the commons. That is, you have been analyzed projects like the SESCs in São Paulo, as close to the concept of the commons. Yeah. This is different from the links generally created between the commons and the public space, common gardens, or common kitchens, or even the shared residence. As you said, the concept of the commons is beyond these spheres that represent the public and private support. Yeah. This wide range of options for imagining possibilities towards space and the studies as common, especially in your area of study in architecture and urban design. In this sense, I would like to know if you haven't seen or analyzed different, like in the SASC, but in different parts of the world, this kind of different possibilities of programs or using space understanding, space in architecture and urban design, understand as a common goals.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to do that all the time, I would say, because one of the big challenges I feel that we have in front of us, and it's also to the students, I think, really an invitation. That, I mean, I'm let's say I'm not satisfied with these, as many people are doing right now, who are saying, well, when we think about the commons, it's also about ephemeral processes of governing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would be the first person to say that these ephemeral processes of governing are important in the city. Obviously, I mean, that is, and it is important that we have, that it's not only the state or the market that is governing, let's say, but that there are other forms of governing. And in that sense, of course, the SESCIs are a very beautiful example. I'm just going to go there for a moment, because the SESCIs are, of course, in their formation, let's say, it is of course an association of small commerces, let's say, which is indeed not a state, not fully the market, let's say, but as another sort of attitude. And I think one of my fields of interest is to see indeed how does this happen in other countries as well. And what we see there is that, for instance, also in other countries you have organizations which we call associations, workers' associations. In France, they call it mutualities, where most of the time there are ideas of helping one another, a certain idea of a mutual interest, but also a mutual responsibility of one another, which also have created buildings in the city. For instance, in France, in Switzerland, in Belgium, you have these big, what they call Palais du Peuple, palaces for the people. And these were typically places also where you had theater halls, meeting rooms, but also places where you could have a pharmacy, a doctor, sometimes restaurants, collective restaurants and kitchens, let's say, that were all offered to the people who were part of these associations. And I think, to me, what is rather frustrating is that also when we look at our histories of the architecture of the city, that many of these programs, they just don't appear because they just don't fit within our thinking of the production of the city. Even though the SESCIs, and there's a lot of attention for the SESCIs in the last years, but many of these other projects, I mean, they're a little bit outside. If we look at the big international histories of the architecture of the city, they're left out because they don't fit in this perspective of it's or the market or the state who's taking the initiative. And I think we have a collective responsibility to bring that to the surface, I would say.
I agree with you. Thank you, Tom.
And thank you for all the comments that I see coming in as well. I'm waving to all the...
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Tom, for the wonderful reply. We have two questions. The first question is from Joanna Martins. And she asks, she makes a compliment about your lecture. She says, "Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And I consider it is necessary to rethink the role of architects, female architects, and your speech helped us to think about that. But couldn't with these new roles or acting roles for the architects, shouldn't limit architecture, and also all the citizens shouldn't limit to the architecture disciplines, but also should expand to all citizens as a politic of critical core. That is how we as architects and female architects could act to activate the commons as a social practice." It's a very complex question, very important question.
No. I think it's a very good question. I think I understand the sense of the question. It is true. I mean, I was even going to say that, but I was running a bit short in time. It is true, of course, that this new role for the architect is thinking the architect as in the theories of the commons, they say a commoner amongst commoners. So what does that mean? That as an architect, you consider yourself amongst other citizens who are commoning. Let's say that would be the ideal. Let's say. Now, at the same time, I'm also not one of these persons who believes that the profession of the architect should dissolve. Let's say. I don't believe in that. I think that we still hold a particular knowledge. I would say a knowledge that might be complementary to some of the other citizens just because of our education. And I think that what we really need to think about is to see our role as complement and our, let's say, expertise, quote unquote, that we still have, our knowledge, that's better said, our knowledge that we still have in relation to the knowledge and the roles that other citizens are taking. But for me, let's say, this role of the architect, urban designer as this dominant, heroic, top-down, if I may say so, paternalistic, I could even say, to relate to the question as well, paternalistic, I'm underlining paternalistic figure is, I think, something that we need to reconsider. And I think the theories of the commons could really help us to reconsider that role as well. I think it's only half an answer that I gave, but maybe at least some kind of an answer. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Yes, thank you, Professor Tom. There is a question from Professor Luis Recamã. He says, "Hi, Tom. It's a pleasure to see you again. I'm going to ask a very direct question. The last few years have witnessed a practical reversal of the possibilities of commons. At first, it seemed like a political reaction, but now it has reached many aspects of our social life. The most emblematic movement towards abandoning the idea of the common is the denial of science, which seems impossible a few years ago. How do you see this reversal from the perspective of urban commons and its future?"
That's, of course, well, I thank my colleague, Professor Recamã, for the nice question, of course, and it's a very fundamental question, of which I can maybe already say as an opening that I will not be able to fully answer it, because I think it's a very, very difficult question. One of the things that I'm thinking about very often is that, as we always see, of course, that some of these ideas of the commons, they've been, I would say, on the one hand, recuperated in other discourses, even in neoliberal discourses, if I may say so. And on the other hand, they've been, I think that's what Professor Recamã is suggesting, they've been weakened, let's say as well. So I wouldn't call it a reversal, but I think it's more a weakening in my perspective. And I think, yeah, it is a challenge in some kind of way that we need to keep this more radical, what Recamã is calling political dimension of these commons alive, let's say as well. But for me, the radical political doesn't necessarily need to be the explicit big radical political. I'm personally also somebody who believes in the micro-political, let's say. What do I mean by the micro-political? The ordinary, everyday political, the actions that everyday citizens, including architects, take on an everyday level. And in that sense, I might be a bit more positive than Recamã, because I really believe that there is something in this micro-political sphere, let's say, that could be done in addition or in complement, if I may say so, to the more explicit meta-political maybe or macro-political sphere as well. But it is true, like with any avant-garde movement, I would say, that the recuperation is, the challenge of the recuperation is constantly there, you know. I don't know if you experience that in Brazil as well, but in Europe, we see now many projects, for instance, new neighborhoods, and then people are given for a year or 2 years the possibility to do some communing practices on that site. But the idea is that in the long run, the developer will take over. This is a bit cynical, but the developer will take over and will develop this according to perfect neoliberal logic, let's say. But it's a way of making the project a bit more socially acceptable, let's say, as well. And I think that this is this recuperation, I would say, of the thinking on the commons. I didn't fully answer, but it was my attempt, let's say, to give some kind of an answer. I see that there is another question as well.
Yes, thank you, Professor Tom, for the reply. Yes.
Should I read it immediately myself?
Yes, you can read it.
Yeah. So what would be the key knowledge from architects and urban designers that makes them still necessary in this process of shifting from top-down practices into bottom-up ones? Well, it's of course, let's say the commons is more than this shift from top-down to bottom-up, but let's say a bit more generally spoken. What remains for me, one very precise set of knowledge that architects and urban designers can bring to the table is the understanding of the long-term evolution of built environments. So what I see when I'm looking at communing processes nowadays is that many people are, of course, very good to work. I mean, citizens work right here, right now, fashion their own dwelling environment and so on. But I think that as architects and as urban designers, we are used to look at the built environment in the very long run, let's say. And I think thinking about that, so it has to do with the long time and the large scale. I think these two elements are for me very important, that we have the capacity to think across time and think on a larger scale level that goes beyond the singular collective, let's say, because many people are doing wonderful projects at the level of the singular collective. But of course, we also need to think about the city at large, to say it as such. And I think there we can really make a difference as architects as well. These are, of course, not the only sets of expertise that we need to develop, because maybe the most important set of expertise that we need to develop right now is to better understand this relation of the commons to the city, to the built environment. So what I'm trying to do in my own way with these three terms, I think that that's really something that should almost become part of the teaching of architectural students, let's say. Let's try to figure out what are the common resources in our cities that we need to take care of. Let's try to figure out what are the common practices that we can relate to. Let's try to figure out what are the common codes in our cities that we could develop or take a position to. These are, for me, knowledges that are maybe already a bit in our education, but also could be expanded, let's say, at the moment. At least when I'm talking about the education at ETH, I'll stick to my own educational institute, let's say. That is, I think, really important. I'm keeping a bit of an eye with the time, and I have, unfortunately, another meeting starting in a minute, let's say, at 3 o'clock. So maybe I can ask that if the people really would still like a nice, still have some questions for me, that they send them to me by email, and I'm trying to maybe answer them by email. Would that be okay?
Yes, no, we can ask both people who asked questions after Renata Lautuf de Oliveira Sanchez, to ask them directly to Sir Tom, and apologize for the lack of time to answer your questions, but we believe that it has been a full debate.
Okay, good. So I also apologize for this very, very limited amount of time, but I'm in a very busy period of the year. But I do thank you for well following the lecture, and I think also for your very insightful questions, I must say. And well, I hope to continue, as I was already saying to colleague Medrano and to colleague Chagas Cavalcanti, that I hope to continue the discussion once in person together with you as well. That would be wonderful, I must say.
Perfect, Tom.
Thank you
very much again, Tom. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.